He branded it a negotiation. The galaxy called it surrender. The invitation that wasn't. The bay locked behind me with a sound like a safe ceiling, and the 7 Keth soldiers on either side of me did not look at me once, which was its own kind of statement. I counted them out of habit. 7, armed with weapons I could identify from Concord registry files but had never seen used. The shuttle shuddered once, stabilized, and began its approach to the flagship. Through the small forward viewport, the absolute mandate filled the entire frame, and then more than the entire frame, and kept filling it as we got closer, the way something large does when it has decided to make a point about its own size. My name is Oren Vass. I was, at that point in my career, Earth's most experienced active diplomat, which is roughly equivalent to being the tallest person in a room full of children. It means something and it does not mean enough, and it was the only card Earth had left to play, so they played it. I had a thermos of bad coffee on my knee and a briefcase on the seat beside me and nothing else, because I was not planning to stay long, one way or another. The Keth Dominion had been moving toward us for 6 years. Not rushing, the Keth do not rush. They angle, they position, they file the paperwork before the conversation begins. By the time Admiral Carl Bates called me out of my posting on Station Vila and put a folder in my hands, the paperwork had already been filed. Ambassador Vrethkar had already made the formal announcement to the Concord. The fleet had already repositioned. We were to report aboard the absolute mandate for what Vrethkar had publicly, graciously, and diplomatically called a negotiation. The galaxy was already calling it something else. I read the folder on the transport, read it twice, made notes in the margins with a pen I had been carrying since 2029, a plain black thing that Bates had looked at the way people look at objects they do not understand and do not have time to ask about. I did not explain it. The folder was thorough. It told me the size of the Keth fleet, the composition of their diplomatic coalition, the terms they were offering, which were the kind of terms you offer someone when you have already decided what the outcome will be and are simply managing the appearance of it. 47 clauses. Clear, clean, reasonable in the way that a locked door is reasonable when you are standing on the wrong side of it. I read to the back page. Clause 47. Notarization requirements. Standard Keth Treaty Law, Article 9, Subsection 4C. Co-signature by 2 neutral Concord members, defined under the Concord Membership Standards Act, current edition. I read that last part again. Current edition. I put my pen down, picked it back up, turned to a blank page at the back of the folder and wrote 3 words, circled them, closed the folder. I did not sleep on the transport. The absolute mandate was large in the way that things are large when their size is meant to carry a message beyond simple dimension. It filled the viewport the way a statement fills a room, not because there is no space left, but because it takes up all the attention available. The escort ships around it were barely visible. Small things standing near a large thing to remind you of the difference. My shuttle docked in a bay that could have held 4 of Earth's orbital stations with room left over. The walls were Keth palestone, the same grey material I had seen in the registry photographs, a surface that absorbed sound the way deep water absorbs light. Everything echoed slightly less than it should, as if the room was eating noise before it could finish. The Keth receiving officer met me at the threshold. He was tall in the way that Keth officials are trained to be tall, not simply their natural height, but a posture that adds another 6 inches of intent to whatever nature gave them. He bowed in the formal Concord style, translated the bow wrong by 1 deliberate degree, which was either a calculated insult or an accident, and I decided on the spot that it did not matter which. I bowed back correctly, he noticed. He led me through 3 corridors and a chamber built for the specific purpose of establishing who owns a moment. The floor had Keth architectural markings I recognized from Concord registry files. Every marking said the same thing in a different style. This belongs to us. The ceiling was high. The approach to the table at the far end was a long, open walk with every eye in the room on the walker. I walked it at a pace that suggested I had somewhere better to be. Ambassador Vrethkar was already seated. I will tell you something about the effect a certain kind of authority has on a room. It is not volume, it is not physical size. It is that everyone in the vicinity becomes slightly more aware of their own breathing. When I entered that chamber, every Keth official and staff member had the quality of people who had just remembered to stand up straight, not because they had been told to, because he was there. He had the kind of gravity that makes lesser people rehearse their sentences on the way in. I had stopped rehearsing sentences in 2031, across a table from a man in a basement in a city I will not name, and the thing I learned in that basement was that rehearsed sentences always sound like rehearsed sentences, and the person across the table always knows it. I walked in and sat down and looked at Vrethkar the way I look at a set of terms, with the specific attention of someone looking for the clause that matters. He spoke first, pleasantries in the Concord standard tongue. His translator rendered them into my earpiece in flat, even English. He welcomed me. He expressed, formally and warmly, his appreciation for humanity's willingness to attend these proceedings. Proceedings, not negotiations. I noted that. A junior official slid a document across the table, heavy pale stone paper. The front page carried the Concord seal and the words instrument of formal resolution in 12 languages. Below that, in smaller text, for review prior to execution. I took it, turned past the cover page, past the preamble, past clauses 1 through 46. I went directly to the back. Clause 47, Notarization Requirements. Standard Keth Treaty Law, Article 9, Subsection 4c. Co-signature by two neutral Concord members, defined under the Concord Membership Standards Act. No edition specified. Here was the thing. Here was the entire thing. The Concord Membership Standards Act had been amended 14 months ago. A procedural revision, mostly. It updated the definition of neutral in the context of co-signature eligibility and added a conflict of interest clause that had been lobbied for by 3 mid-tier species who had been burned by biased notarization in a previous territorial dispute. The amendment passed quietly. Nobody paid much attention because nobody involved in those proceedings was dealing with a species annexation of this scale. Nobody except a woman named Hesse Morin, who had drafted a supplementary note to the amendment in her capacity as Earth's Concord Standards representative, cross-referencing Article 9 treaties, and who had died in 2038 and had never once met a Keth in her life. I had found her note in the archive 6 days ago, 3 in the morning, bad coffee, no expectations. Under the amended act, 4 of the 6 species Vrethkar had pre-cleared, as notaries fell squarely inside the new conflict of interest definition, due to exclusive trade agreements they had signed with the Keth Dominion in the past 2 years. I looked up at Vrethkar across the table. I looked at the document. I looked back at Vrethkar. Well, here we are. Ambassador, I said, would it be possible for me to have a word with your legal counsel? The room had a specific kind of quiet after that, not silence, full of things that everyone present was calculating simultaneously. Vrethkar's expression did not change. His expression almost never changed, I would learn. But something behind his eyes shifted in the way that something behind the surface of still water shifts when something large has moved below it. Of course, he said. I set the document down, put my pen on top of it. My thermos was empty, but I held it anyway because the habit of holding it helped me think. One way or another. What they didn't know about patience. The legal counsel arrived 40 minutes after I asked for him. His name came through my translator as Advocate Kern. He was shorter than the average Keth official and had the look of someone who had spent so long in treaty archives that natural light had become a professional inconvenience. The 40-minute delay told me 2 things. The request had surprised them enough to require internal conversation, and they were composed enough not to let that surprise show in the timing. He sat across from me in a side room off the main chamber. Pale stone walls, 1 table, 2 chairs, no windows. The kind of room that exists in every bureaucratic structure on every world I have visited. The room where the real conversation happens before the official one resumes. He had a Keth data scroll in his hands that he had not opened, a prop, veteran move. I set my thermos on the table. The Concord Membership Standards Act, I said, was amended 14 months ago. He said nothing, the silence was careful. Article 9, subsection 4c, requires co-signature by two neutral Concord members as defined under that act. I put the document on the table, open to clause 47. Your treaty does not specify which edition applies. The current edition is standard, Kern said. Yes, I said, it is. He looked at me, I looked at him. The ventilation system was very loud suddenly. Under the current edition, I said, 4 of your pre-cleared notaries are ineligible. The revised Conflict of Interest Clause, Appendix B, covers species with active exclusive trade agreements with either party to a treaty of annexation. The Yithran Collective, the Borathi Assembly, the Sondi Neutral States, and the Marchell Consortium all signed exclusive trade frameworks with the Keth Dominion within the past 2 years. Kern opened his data scroll. His eyes moved. He was searching and not finding, and the not finding was happening in his face in a way he was trying to control. That leaves 2 eligible notaries on your pre-cleared list, I said. Under Concord procedure, a treaty of annexation of a registered species requires co-signature, 2 notaries. You have 2 eligible, which is technically sufficient. I paused. Except that the Velhari delegation, your second remaining eligible notary, submitted a notice of recusal 14 days ago on unrelated treaty matters. The recusal is blanket and covers all Concord proceedings for the next 60 days, pending internal review. I have the filing reference number if that would be useful. Kern closed his data scroll. The ventilation hummed. Your remaining eligible notary, I said, is the Doroth Observation Group, 1 signature, which does not meet the minimum co-signature requirement. I picked up my thermos. It was empty, but the habit helped. I am not here to make accusations, I said. I am here to point out that the document your ambassador has asked me to sign cannot, under current Concord law, be legally executed. Not today, not with the notaries currently available. Kern stood up. He was precise about it, the way people are precise when they are controlling something they would rather not release. I will need to confer with the ambassador, he said. Of course. He left, I stayed. The ventilation hummed on. I thought about Hesse Morin, who had died of a quiet illness in a city I had never visited, who had written 13 pages that nobody in Earth's Concord office had read properly in 7 years, who had built a foundation under an outcome she would never see, who had done the work carefully and filed it and moved on without needing to know what it would become. I thought about what she would have said about this room. I was still thinking about it when the door opened and a young Keth official stepped in with a tray. Low rank from the insignia, early enough in a career to still have curiosity that had not yet been trained out of her. She placed a cup on the table. The liquid inside was the color of a bruise on pale skin. She looked at my thermos. I was told the human drinks from that container, she said. I do. I can fill it. This is what we drink when we are thinking about difficult things. I looked at the cup. Why not? I said. She poured it in. I drank. It tasted like dark tea crossed with something mineral and something else I could not identify, and it had the effect of making my thoughts very clear and very quiet at the same time. She did not leave. Are you afraid? She said. I thought about the fleet outside, the locked bay, the document that could not be legally executed. I thought about Bates, who had looked at me the morning I left, the way people look at things they are not sure are coming back. A little, I said. That was mostly true. She nodded as if that was the right answer and left. The formal session resumed 2 hours later. I walked back into the main chamber and took my seat. Vrethkar looked at me from across the table with the expression of a man who had just discovered a locked door. he did not know existed. That expression told me exactly where we were, which was the most useful thing that had happened to me all day. He had planned a proceeding. What he got was a process. I began asking questions, not arguments. Questions, small ones, simple ones, the kind that appear to be procedural clarification, but are in fact nails being tapped carefully into a structural beam. I asked about the notary selection process and whether the pre-cleared list had been reviewed following the Standards Act amendment. I asked about the Velhari recusal filing and whether it had been factored into the timeline. I asked about the definition of neutral under the current Standards Act and whether the Keth legal team had reviewed Appendix B in the context of recent trade frameworks. After the fourth question, Vrethkar's legal team asked for a recess. I agreed. I refilled my thermos from the flask the young official had left beside my chair. I sat in the side room and did not rehearse anything. Rehearsal is what you do when you do not know your material. I knew my material. What I thought about in that recess was something older than Article 9. Humanity spent 200 years being the youngest, weakest, and most diplomatically irrelevant species in the Concord. The galaxy looked at us and saw something quick and loud and new, and they were right on 3 of those counts. The fourth count is the one nobody has ever gotten correct. We are new and we know it, and we are not embarrassed by it the way the galaxy expects us to be, because new means that every single system we ever built, we built from scratch. And when you build from scratch, you read everything. You read everything because you cannot afford to inherit assumptions. Hessa Morin read everything. I read what she left. That is all this was. The recess ended. I walked back in and sat down. Vrethkar looked across the table at me. "What is it exactly that you believe you are doing?" he said. The room went completely still. "Negotiating," I said. He held that, set it down carefully, the way you set down something expensive. "You have nothing to negotiate with," he said. I put my hand on the document, on Clause 47. "Ambassador," I said, "neither do you." The only thing I brought. The silence after those words had texture to it, not empty, full of things that everyone in the room was calculating at the same time, running numbers on what had just been said and what it cost and where it led. Vrethkar looked at me for 3 seconds. In human terms, that is not a long time. In Keth diplomatic terms, 3 seconds of unbroken eye contact from a senior ambassador is the equivalent of standing up at a formal dinner and speaking without being addressed. He did not do that. He simply looked, and in those 3 seconds, something behind his eyes moved the way something large moves behind still water. He did not speak. Kern, seated 2 positions to his left, had his data scroll open and was reading with the focus of a man searching for an exit. I pulled the document back to my side of the table, not aggressively, carefully, the way you move something that belongs to you. Clause 47 requires co-signature by 2 eligible neutral Concord members as defined under the current Standards Act, I said. Under the current Act, 4 of your 6 pre-cleared notaries are ineligible due to conflict of interest. Your 5th pre-cleared notary has filed a blanket recusal. Your 6th does not constitute a quorum under the co-signature requirement. I opened to the page, turned the document to face the room. This treaty, as currently drafted, cannot be legally notarized. A treaty that cannot be legally notarized is not a treaty. It is a document. Documents do not transfer sovereignty under Concord law. Kern stopped reading. He looked at me. He had the face of a man who had just confirmed something he had been hopping was not true. In the upper section of the chamber, where the Concord observation feeds were active, small illuminated signals indicated the live broadcast to member species diplomatic channels. There had been 47 of them when I walked in that morning. There were 43 now. 4 had gone dark. I did not say anything about it. I kept my voice at the same level and pace it had held for the past 4 hours, steady, clear. Slightly dull, the voice of a man discussing procurement schedules. I want to be clear, I said. I am not here to prevent a resolution. I am not here to obstruct these proceedings or to make accusations about the intent behind the current document. It is entirely possible that the notary situation is an oversight, a consequence of the Standards Act amendment being recent and the treaty preparation timeline predating it. I paused. What I am here to do is negotiate terms under which Earth and the Keth Dominion can reach a binding, legally enforceable agreement that will hold under Concord scrutiny and survive challenge from any member species who might later wish to contest it. 3 more lights went dark in the observation section. 7 gone now. If the current document is executed without eligible notarization, I said, it does not transfer sovereignty. It creates a contested status. A contested status is not stable. It invites challenge, counterclaims, neutrality objections, and procedural reviews. The Concord has a backlog of contested status cases going back 40 years. Those proceedings run on the Concord's timeline, not the Dominion's, and the Concord's timeline favors no party. I closed the document. I am offering an alternative. Vrethkar spoke for the first time in 11 minutes. Explain. I had 3 pages of notes in my briefcase. I did not take them out. A mutual recognition framework, I said, not annexation, not the terms on the current document, a formal treaty of recognized independent status for Earth, with defined terms for Keth operational access to systems within 5 parsecs of current Dominion space, trade framework included, border definitions included, dispute resolution protocol included, notarized under 3 eligible Concord members I have already verified against the current Standards Act. The room was silent in a way that felt like weight. This framework gives the Keth Dominion everything of practical value that the current document was designed to provide: access, stability, defined terms, an end to the unresolved status question. What it does not provide is a categorical transfer of sovereignty, because that transfer cannot be executed cleanly under current conditions. I looked at Vrethkar directly. A clean resolution protects both parties, an unclean one protects neither. Kern was writing on his data scroll, fast writing, the fast writing of someone doing damage assessment. In the observation section, 2 more lights went dark. 9 gone. These were not small or peripheral species. I knew from the Concord registry which diplomatic channels those 9 signals represented. 3 of them were key members of the Keth coalition. They had not left because they were bored. They had left because the calculation had changed and they were doing the new one privately before making any public moves. A contested status annexation is not only a Keth problem. When you cosign a coalition document that contains a structural legal defect, the defect belongs to everyone whose name appears on the document. The allied species in that chamber had signed on to a clean and certain outcome. They had not signed on to 40 years of Concord procedural review. I had not planned those 9 departures that requires statting clearly. I had planned the treaty argument. I had planned the alternative framework. I had found the clause and I had built the case and I had arrived prepared. But the departures, those were arithmetic, not strategy. When you introduce accurate information into a room full of people who have built their positions on different information, the arithmetic does its own work. You do not need to direct it. You only need to not be in the way when it moves. Hessa Morin understood that. She had spent her entire career introducing accurate information into Concord chambers, filing it carefully, and letting the system's own processes do the work, slowly, over years, in ways nobody noticed until they mattered. I had just compressed her timeline considerably. Vrethkar called for a recess. I gathered my document, picked up my thermos, walked out of the chamber the same way I had walked in. The young official was waiting outside the door. She did not say anything. She simply fell into step beside me, walked me to the side room, and refilled my thermos without being asked. I sat, drank. She stood near the door. 9 observation feeds went dark, she said after a while. Her voice was careful, each word chosen before it was released. I know. That has not happened before, in a formal session. I know. She looked at me in her particular way, which was the look of someone composing a question they are not sure they should ask out loud. The treaty, she said, was it always broken, or did you break it? I thought about that. It was a genuinely good question. It was always the way it was, I said. I just read it. She left quietly, the door closed, the ventilation hummed. I opened my briefcase and took out the 3 pages of notes for the alternative framework. I read them again, slowly, looking for anything I might have missed. The framework was clean. I had checked it against 6 different Concord legal standards over 4 days of work. On 3 of those days, I had cross-referenced every treaty Earth had ever filed with the Concord, looking for anything that could be used against us in a counter-argument. I found 2 things, fixed them, refiled the corrected versions in the Concord archive under routine maintenance flags 2 weeks before the session. Routine maintenance flags are the least read documents in the Concord system. Hessa Morin had taught me that in her supplementary note without knowing she was teaching anyone. The door opened. It was Kern. He sat down without being invited. That was new. It meant the protocol structure was coming down and the real conversation was starting. "The framework you proposed," he said. "Yes. How long have you been preparing it?" 6 days. He was quiet for a moment. 6 days. I am a fast reader. He did not find that funny. He was not supposed to. But something shifted in his face, very slightly, and I thought that if we had met in a different room under different circumstances, we might have been the kind of people who could have a real conversation. "The ambassador will want to review the framework in full," he said. "Of course. This will take time." "I have time," I held up my thermos, "as long as someone keeps filling this." He stood, he looked at the thermos, he looked at me. "You came here with a briefcase and a thermos," he said, "nothing else." That was all I had. He left. Outside, through the pale stone walls, the absolute mandate hummed with the sound of a very large machine continuing to operate, regardless of what the people inside it were deciding. The only thing I had brought was what Hessa Morin had left me. It turned out to be enough. Watching a coalition eat itself. I was given quarters on the 8th level of the absolute mandate. The room was not small. The Keth understand that space carries a message, and the message here was that I was a guest rather than a prisoner, which was technically true and practically the same thing. The viewport was real glass, which is unusual on a vessel this size. Most windows on a ship like this are screens, but this was actual structural glass, 2 inches thick, cold to the touch in a way that screens never are. I discovered this by pressing my palm against it and feeling the temperature that comes from actual space. I stood at the viewport for a long time. Outside, the escort fleet held its positions, 20 vessels, each one larger than anything Earth had in active service. They sat in formation with the precise stillness of objects that are not drifting but waiting. 6 of the vessels I could identify from registry files as belonging to allied species rather than the Keth directly. I noted their positions. I had a pad of paper from my briefcase and I drew what I was seeing. The fleet formation, the positions, the allied vessels. I marked the 9 whose observation feed signals had gone dark during the session. I studied the drawing. The Concord feeds that Kern's staff had not cut came through on the room's terminal, which they had activated before I arrived. I used it to access the open diplomatic registry. The 9 dark signals had become 11. I sat with that for a moment. 11 species diplomatic observers had quietly withdrawn from the live feed of a formal Keth annexation session. In Concord history, that number in a single session had not happened before, to my knowledge. Observers pull feeds for internal review, for political calculations, for the kind of private conversation that cannot happen while you are publicly registered as an active participant. They do not do that when the calculation still looks the way it looked in the morning. 2 of the 11 were species that had co-signed the Keth Coalition's initial declaration of intent, 6 years ago, not minor signatories. The kind whose names on a document change what the document means. Their withdrawal from the feed, even temporarily, even for private consultation, was a signal that every other Concord member watching the registry would notice and begin interpreting. I made notes, wrote down names, positions, the pattern I could see forming. It looked like a fracture developing in very cold material, too slow to watch in real time, too certain to stop once it had started. I put the notes away and ate the meal the Keth staff had brought, which was not food I recognized, but was warm and not unpleasant, and I thought about the message Admiral Bates had sent 4 hours ago that I had not yet answered. 3 days ago his message had read, "We are behind you." 2 days ago, "The Council is watching." Yesterday, "Please confirm you are okay." Today it read, "Status report." I wrote back, "Proceedings ongoing, framework submitted for review, stand by." I did not write, 11 observers have pulled their feeds. I did not write, "The coalition is running arithmetic that no longer adds up for them." I do not write things like that in messages that can be accessed by the wrong people at the wrong moment, and optimism is a liability in a proceeding that is not finished yet. I was lying on the room's sleeping platform with my eyes open, running Article 9 through my head again, when someone knocked on the door. Not a staff knock, not the precise triple tap that Keth officials used, a single knock, even, controlled. I sat up. "Come in," I said. Ambassador Vrethkar opened the door himself. No staff, no escort, no protocol officer walking ahead to establish the correct formal register, just the ambassador, in a lighter version of his formal sash, standing in the doorway of my quarters as if this was something he did routinely. I stood up, not because I had to, because it was the right thing to do. He looked at the room, at the pad of paper on the table with my drawing of the fleet formation, at my thermos and my briefcase and the Keth meal tray, at me. "Sit," he said, "please." I sat. He took the other chair, not the one I had been using, the one across from it. He sat the way he always sat, straight, composed, the posture of someone who has worn authority long enough that it requires no maintenance. But the absence of staff gave the composure a different quality here. It was not performance. It was simply how he held himself. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I would like an honest answer rather than a diplomatic one. Those are sometimes the same thing." Not often. Something moved in his eyes. "What does Earth actually want?" I looked at him. This was the question beneath all the other questions, the one that formal proceedings are architecturally designed to prevent from being asked out loud. Both parties can negotiate extensively without ever saying what they actually need, because saying what you need makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability in a formal setting costs something real. He was asking me here, without witnesses, without the record running. "To still exist in 10 years, I said, "in a form we recognize." He considered that. He sat with it. "The annexation framework would have guaranteed that," he said. "Earth's population, infrastructure, and civil structure would have remained intact under Keth protectorate governance. The terms were not punitive." They were not, I agreed. They were fair for what they were. Then what is the objection? I thought about how to say this, not to persuade him. He was not someone who needed to be sold something. I was trying to tell him the truth, which is a different kind of work. "The objection is what comes after," I said, "not the terms on paper. The reality 20 years from now, when the generation that signed the document is gone and the next one is looking at the relationship as a fact rather than a choice. Protectorate status is not stable over time. It creates a category of people, protectorate citizens, who are not fully part of the Dominion and not fully independent. That category produces a specific kind of resentment. The kind that is very patient and very thorough and eventually very destructive." I paused. "We know this. We have done it to each other, on our own world, more times than I want to count." Vrethkar was quiet. He looked at the viewport, at the fleet outside. "The mutual recognition framework you proposed," he said. Yes. It gives the Keth dominion less on paper. Less on paper, I said, more in practice. A recognized independent neighbor with defined terms is stable. A contested protectorate is not. The dominion gains operational access, border definition, a trade framework, and a resolution that will not be challenged in the Concord for 50 years. That is worth more than a sovereignty transfer that cannot be cleanly notarized. He turned back from the viewport. He looked at me with the direct attention of someone who had stopped translating what he saw through the frame of what he had expected to find. You came here with a briefcase and a thermos, he said. I had a pen too. Nothing changed in his face, but something in the room shifted slightly. Not quite humor, something drier and less comfortable than humor, the recognition between two people who have spent their entire careers in rooms where the wrong word costs something real, that they are sitting across from someone who also knows what those rooms cost. My coalition is running calculations, he said. It was not a question. 11 feeds went dark. He nodded once, he already knew. They will ask me what happened here, he said. I will need to give them an account. You can tell them you identified a legal defect in the document before execution and moved to a stronger framework. That is accurate. It does not require the version where Earth's representative found it first. He looked at me for a long moment. Is that the version you will give? I will give the version that serves the agreement, I said. The agreement is what matters. The story about the agreement is secondary. He stood, straightened his sash in a movement that was precise and unhurried and completely unconscious. He walked to the door, stopped. He said something in unmodified Keth, not through the translator. A few syllables, deliberate, at the pace of a sentence being chosen carefully rather than delivered. My translator clicked, failed, clicked again. I will look that up later, I said. He left. The door closed. I sat in the quiet for a long time. The fleet held its positions outside the viewport. The absolute mandate hummed. I opened my pad to a blank page and wrote down the closest phonetic approximation of what I had heard, so I would remember it accurately. I circled it. I did not know what it meant yet. I thought I would know more about what it meant when I found out how the morning went. What they called it after. The morning came in through the viewport glass, the way mornings come in space, not gradually, not with the slow brightening of an atmosphere catching the sun, but all at once, a hard line of reflected starlight across the floor as the flagship's orbit brought it around to the light side. I was already awake. I had been awake for most of the night, which was not insomnia. I sleep adequately, even in difficult circumstances, but the kind of necessary alertness that the body produces when it understands that something significant is approaching and presence is required. I checked the Concord registry at 400, 15 feeds dark now, 4 more since I had last looked. I washed up in the Keth facility the room provided, which used a different method than human showers but accomplished the same basic outcome. I put on the same clothes I had worn the day before because I had not brought others. I drank the last of the bruise-colored tea from my thermos. Then I thought about what I knew and what I did not know. I knew the framework was legally sound. I had built it to be. I knew the Keth had spent the night in coalition consultation. 15 dark feeds confirmed that. I knew Vrethkar was not a man who made decisions without understanding their full weight. What I did not know was whether his coalition would hold. An embarrassed coalition is not a predictable one. When people who have spent 6 years building toward a specific outcome are told that the outcome has changed shape, they do not simply adjust. They argue, they assign responsibility. They look for the place where the plan went wrong and someone to put in that place. If Vrethkar absorbed that, if he took the internal account of yesterday's session as a personal cost, the agreement might hold, but it would cost him something real. If he deflected it outward, the agreement might not hold, but he would be protected. I had told him the night before that the story about the agreement was secondary. I had meant it. I also knew that stories are never actually secondary. They are the structure inside which real things either survive or are quietly buried. Those thoughts were not mine to manage. I put them away. At 800, a staff officer knocked with the precise triple tap and informed me that the formal session would resume in 1 hour. I said thank you. I picked up my briefcase and my thermos, and I walked the corridor to the reception chamber alone. The escort that had been assigned to me the previous day was not present. I noted that. I did not know whether the absence was a concession or an oversight or a test. I walked at the same pace regardless. The chamber had the same configuration as the day before. The long table, the high ceiling, the lighting from above. But the observation section was different. 15 of the 47 signals that had been active at the start of yesterday's session were still dark. The remaining 32 were lit, but half of them had the slightly dim quality of feeds that were active but not yet fully committed species who had returned for the morning session without having decided what to make of it yet. Vrethkar was already at the table. His coalition members were present. 3 of the species who had been among the first 9 to pull their feeds were back in their seats, in their formal positions. They had the collective quality of people who had made a decision and were now performing the commitment at full professional volume. I have seen that display in every diplomatic context I have ever worked in, on every world, from every species. It is always the same. They had done the calculation. They had decided the revised outcome worked for them, or at least worked well enough to put their names on. Kern was present with a new data scroll and an expression that had been cleaned of everything that had been on it yesterday, replaced with the smooth professional surface of someone who has finished the difficult internal work and is ready for the external process. I sat down, put my briefcase on the floor, my thermos on the table. Vrethkar looked at me once, direct, no translation. Then he looked at the table. The Keth Dominion has reviewed the alternative framework submitted by Earth's representative, he said, and finds it to be a suitable basis for proceeding. The room was very still. Not the surprised stillness of the day before, a different kind, the stillness of something having been decided, a weight held in position finally released, the collective breath of a room full of beings who had been waiting to know which direction they were walking in. We propose to proceed with the mutual recognition and defined terms framework as submitted, Vrethkar said, subject to the following amendments. He laid out 3. They were small. 2 were language clarifications that tightened definitions I had left slightly open on purpose. I had left them open because I expected negotiation, and his legal team had found exactly the places I had left for them to find. The 3rd was a modification to the trade access timeline, extending the initial review period from 3 years to 5. I reviewed each one, accepted the first 2 immediately, counted the 3rd at 4 years. Kern replied at 4.5. I accepted. 4.5 years. I wrote it in my margin notes with a small star beside it. We moved through the document clause by clause. 5 points of substantive discussion, 14 points of language clarification, 2 moments where Kern and I went back and forth long enough that Vrethkar called a 5-minute break. During the second break, the young official, Seri, she had told me her name in the same offhand way of someone who expected it not to be remembered, brought me a fresh flask of tea without being asked. I sat with it in the corridor outside the chamber, and she sat nearby without quite sitting next to me. "It is going to be signed," she said. "Seems likely." She was quiet for a moment. "Yesterday I did not think that, none of us did." "What did you think?" "That this was a formality." She looked at the closed chamber door. "That you were here because the process required a representative, not because the process would actually change." I thought about that. I thought about Bates, who had sent me because the process required a representative, and about whether he had believed the process would change. He had not. He had sent me because sending me was the only thing left to do, and doing something, even an insufficient thing, is what people do when they cannot bear to do nothing. That is not weakness. That is the specific kind of persistence that gets called different names depending on whether it works. I did not know it would change, I said. I thought it might. There is a difference. Seri looked at me for a moment, with the quality of someone filing something away carefully for a long time. The break ended. I went back in. The signing was not dramatic. Ceremonies rarely are when the real work has already been done. The drama was yesterday, in the questions and the silence and the feeds going dark one after another. Today was administration. Vrethkar signed first, then his coalition members in order of precedence. Then the 3 eligible neutral Concord notaries I had verified beforehand, who signed through the Concord's remote authentication system without issue. When it was my turn, I signed with the pen I had been carrying since 2029, plain black. Nobody asked about it. The document was sealed, authentication codes transmitted, filed in the Concord Registry under the newly created Category Mutual Recognition Treaty, Class 1, which was a category that had not existed until I submitted the framework paperwork 5 days earlier using a provisional classification form that Hesse Morin had included in her supplementary note as an example of an underused administrative tool. I set my pen down on the table and sat back. The room moved into post-signing formalities. Statements were made in the Concord standard tongue. Feed signals that had gone dark began returning one by one as the outcome became official, and the species who had been watching from careful distance logged back in to be recorded as having witnessed the resolution. 38 of 47 by the time the session formally concluded. 9 stayed dark. Some calculations do not resolve in a single morning. That is fine. Those 9 species had the Concord Registry record now. They would draw their own conclusions in their own time. Vrethkar's closing statement was 3 sentences, precise, correct, and contained exactly what was required and nothing more. He was thinking about the internal account he had to give, not the external record he was leaving. I understood that. My own statement was 2 sentences. I thanked the Keth Dominion for their willingness to engage in a process that served both parties. Done. Then it was over. I gathered my briefcase, my thermos, my pen. I expected to be walked out by staff in the standard escort fashion, 3 officials, formal pace, the long corridor to the shuttle bay. Instead, when I reached the chamber door, Vrethkar was behind me. He did not announce this. He simply fell into step beside me. No staff. For the second time in 2 days, he set aside the protocol that his entire environment was built to maintain, and did it so smoothly that it registered not as a break, but as a deliberate choice. We walked the corridor. The framework will be studied, he said, not quite to me, more to the corridor itself. Good. Other species will examine it. They will ask how it was constructed. That is all right. They will look at the notary clause situation. He paused. They will look at who identified it. Let them look. We reached the intersection that led to the shuttle bay. He stopped. I stopped. My coalition members, he said, are framing what happened here as a strategic refinement, a proactive decision to pursue a more legally durable outcome. He said it flatly, stating a fact rather than asking a question. That is one accurate description of what happened, I said. It is not the complete description. No. They do not know the complete one. No. He looked at me for a moment that held more than its length. Then he said something in unmodified Keth again. The same few syllables as the night before, the same deliberate pace, the same quality of care that goes into a sentence being chosen rather than simply produced. My translator clicked, failed. Gave me a partial fragment, something that might have indicated recognition, something that might have carried the idea of an equal, something the translation algorithm did not have a category for. I still cannot translate that, I said. I know, he said. He turned and walked back the way we had come. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The hum of the absolute mandates surrounded me, the sound of a very large machine continuing to function. I turned, and walked to the shuttle bay. Seri was standing at the docking threshold. This was not her post. She had come here on her own time. She held out a small flat package, wrapped in pale keth paper. "It is the tea," she said, "enough for a long journey, for when you are thinking about difficult things." I took it, put it in my briefcase. "Thank you," I said. She made the gesture she had made before, the one my translator had no word for, the one that might mean something approximately like this specific and stubborn kind of continuing, or something more complicated than that, something that would have required a kind of translation my device was not built for. I got on the shuttle. The bay doors closed with the sound of a safe sealing. The shuttle moved. Through the small viewport, I watched the hull of the Absolute Mandate slide past, that enormous pale grey wall with its absorbed sound and its claimed space and its markings that said, in every architectural language available, "This belongs to us." Then open space, stars, the escort fleet holding positions in the dark. Then the fleet getting smaller. Then nothing. I drank the last cold residue at the bottom of my thermos and looked out at the stars and thought about nothing in particular, which is a specific skill that takes years to develop and which I had needed more times than I cared to count. The transport back to Station Vila took 11 hours. I slept for 6 of them. When I woke up, I looked at the phonetic transcription I had made of Vrethkar's words and ran it through 2 different translation databases and an academic Keth linguistics archive that a researcher I had once worked with had spent 15 years compiling. The phrase did not have a standard translation. The closest the linguistics archive could offer was a compound construction with no direct equivalent in any human language. It combined the Keth word for an opponent whose methods cannot be dismissed with a secondary meaning that described the quality of something that continues past the point where it should have stopped. The way a root continues through stone, not because it is strong in any dramatic sense, but because it does not know how to stop. Not brave. Not a hero. Just continuing. I wrote it down, closed the pad, looked out the viewport at the stars going past. Admiral Bates met me at Station Vila's docking ring. He had 4 other officers with him, and a look on his face I had seen before, the face of someone who has been waiting for very bad news and has just found out it is a different kind of news entirely, and does not yet have a framework for what that means. "The Council wants a briefing," he said. "Of course. There is also," he paused, "there is some discussion of a formal ceremony, a recognition." I picked up my briefcase. "Is the commissary open?" He blinked. "It is 900, so, yes, I believe." "I would like a sandwich," I said. "Then I will do the briefing. The ceremony can wait." He walked beside me in the particular silence of someone who has spent the last 3 days preparing for several different outcomes and is still computing which one has arrived. "How was it?" he said finally. I thought about the pale stone walls eating sound, the bruise-colored tea, Seri's untranslatable gesture at the docking threshold, the young Keth official asking me if I was afraid in a side room with no windows, Kern's face when the calculation changed, 15 dark feed signals in the Concord registry at 4 in the morning, Vrethkar walking beside me in the corridor without staff, setting down protocol like a jacket he no longer needed. I thought about Hesse Morin, who had died in 2038 without meeting a single Keth in her life, who had written 13 pages that nobody read, who had done the careful and unglamorous work of someone who understood that the right word placed in the right archive at the right time is a kind of power that operates on its own timeline and answers to no one. "Productive," I said. The sandwich was not good. The coffee was considerably worse. I ate every bite of both and wrote my official report at the commissary table, 2 paragraphs, clean and precise, and accurate in the way that all official reports are accurate, which is to say they contain the truth without containing all of it. The rest of it went into a different document. I wrote it that evening, alone in the quarters Station Vila assigned me. I wrote it in full, the notary clause, the quiet recess room, Seri's tea, the 15 dark feed signals, Vrethkar at my door without staff, the untranslated phrase, and what the linguistics archive had offered for it. I encrypted it, filed it under a case number that would sit in the archive with all the other case numbers that no one pulls unless they know what they are looking for. I thought about who might find it someday. Some diplomat, maybe 2 generations from now, in a room in the middle of the night, running out of options, reading everything because they cannot afford to inherit assumptions. I hoped they would find it useful. I hoped they would find Hesse Morin first.